Welcome to the Aid Market Podcast, where foreign aid partners connect to learn about key funding trends and market insight. The podcast is co-hosted by Aid Connect Data, the pipeline and market intel software for USAID partnering, and Connected International, the leading USAID partnering support consulting firm. Now, here's your host, Mike Shanley.
Welcome to the Aid Market Podcast. Very excited today to have Alexis Bonnell, the former USAID Chief Innovation Officer, and Mohamed Abdel-Kader, the current USAID Chief Innovation Officer, on as guests to discuss USAID's work in technology, innovation, and AI. Today's episode is co-hosted with the Society for International Development US. Both myself and our guest Alexis are board members of SID US. As I've said many times on this show, in my opinion, it is the premier association for any members or any partners interested in working with USAID to be members of. It includes the established primes, local organizations, small businesses, organizations of all types that want to do work with USAID. They have a couple of upcoming events I want to note. On February 15th, they are hosting their annual career fair. And on April 26th, SID US is hosting their annual conference in Washington, D.C. and virtually. I think that is the must-attend event of the year again for anyone interested in working with USAID. Feel free to message me on LinkedIn or go right to SID's website for any questions on membership, sponsoring, participating in any of these events. With that, let's get right into it with our guests today. So Mohamed, as we mentioned, is the Chief Innovation Officer at USAID. He's also the Executive Director for the Innovation, Technology, and Research Hub at USAID. Prior to that, he advised companies, leading NGOs, and multilateral organizations on their most pressing issues. He served in the Obama administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary for International and Foreign Language Education in the U.S. Department of Education, and later led the Aspen Institute's Stevens initiative. Alexis, welcome back to the show. Alexis is the former Chief Innovation Officer at USAID, former business executive at Google, and the current Chief Information Officer of Digital Capabilities Directorate of the Air Force Research Laboratory. Thank you both so much for being here. And I want to get right into it. Mohamed, could you start us off and share a little bit about what your role as Chief Innovation Officer at USAID entails?
Well, first, thanks for having me, Mike. It's good to see you, and Alexis, good to see you again. I think, look, I kind of characterize my role as like the cheerleader for innovation. I don't know if Alexis, if you felt that way, but I feel like a big part of our work is really raising the profile of the really cool things that happen across the agency, and specifically with the team that I lead, the Innovation, Technology, and Research Hub, which some may be familiar with, was formerly the Global Development Lab. We're really on the cutting edge of development. We're testing and trying to scale new and innovative, things that work and will hopefully push the boundaries of development to reach more people in more effective ways and more cost-efficient ways. We focus a big part of our work on the digital space, which I know we're going to be talking about quite a bit today. We have a significant technology division, which is probably about half of our hub. And in the technology division, we're doing everything from, cybersecurity to emerging technologies like artificial intelligence to digital finance and digital inclusion and digital literacy. And we've got an amazing geo center that's looking at imagery of the world and trying to draw some analyses from it. And we're also doing, promoting science for development through our research division. And the three pieces really work together. So my job is really to tell that story, to elevate it, to lift it, to weave it into the agency, and make sure folks know what kind of amazing tools are available to them. So that's a little bit about what we do, and I'm excited about it.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Mohamed. We're going to get into a lot of detail on that. Alexis, as you're hearing Mohamed talk about that, obviously technology, not just year to year, is changing, but week to week. As new technologies are released. What does that make you think about from your time just a couple years ago at USAID in terms of what were the priorities that you were looking at and working on then?
Mohammed and team are doing incredible work, and there's no one who has more empathy for what he's trying to pull off than I do. I think what's so interesting is really, the fact that, USAID continues to be committed to leaning in, right, to new technologies, new tools, and continuing to resource this. I was, reflecting the other day that I remember a time in, USAID's history where no one understood why we would need a team focused on mobile phones. No one thought that that was relevant to develop.
Yeah, thank you, Alexis. And she dropped off. She'll be back on in a second. So Mohammed, let's move on to the next thing. What are some specific use cases? I think that's something that our audience will be interested in. Obviously, as we mentioned, things are changing regularly, but what are some of the early use cases, pilot projects? I'm
going to try to find a more stable connection.
Yeah, no worries, Alexis. Just jump right back in. In the meantime, Mohammed's going to share a couple of the early use cases that he's seen of AI applications or other technologies.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mike. I mean, I think, look, it's a really exciting space. And I think it's one where before we jump into the use cases, I think it is important to talk about, AI is an incredibly powerful tool. And there's a risk that a lot of people will be left behind. A lot of people could be hurt by it. But there's also tremendous opportunity. And I don't necessarily see that as just a binary, right? Like, I think in many ways, that's a spectrum. There's the detriment and there is the benefit. And there's a whole spectrum in between. And there's a whole host of unintended things, unintended consequences, things that we just don't know how it's going to play out, to be quite frank, with such a powerful and quickly moving technology. I'll say in terms of a couple of use cases, I'm really proud to see that USAID has been in this game for a while. This isn't necessarily new for us. Although we've seen in the news, ChatGPT has really raised the profile of artificial intelligence certainly in the last year. It's been on everyone's mind. But artificial intelligence is not new to USAID. I'll give you a couple of use cases. We're using artificial intelligence in a number of different spaces. We've been partnering with Duke University to predict authoritarian clampdown by using artificial intelligence to scan over 90 million news articles. And what the team at Duke has been able to do is that they proved that machine learning can actually predict the closing of a civic space in the future from a 1, 3, and 6 month window with statistically significant accuracy. And that's really helpful for us as we think about democratic backsliding around the world. Take another example. Food insecurity is something that hits a lot of communities around the world. Think about a single farmer who may be having to manage a big plot of land on their own. And with all of the changes in the environment and the natural world around us, you're getting these bugs and, bugs meaning that sometimes your crops are sick. Well, what we've been able to do is, Kansas State University, one of our partners, has partnered with University in Uganda, Makerere University, and they've developed essentially a smartphone application for imaging crop disease. So think of the farmer who's able to take their phone and take a photo of a crop, and the app is basically able to log in what's happening, and also able to say, hey, you may want to quarantine this plant and pull it aside because it's diseased. So think about what that means for crop yields, what that means for that farmer's income, what that means for the nutritional value of the crop getting on someone's plate. You've got more food going on someone's plate. So that's an incredible use of AI. I mentioned a little bit earlier, we have this amazing geocenter that is taking essentially very high quality satellite imagery of the planet and looking at various insights that help us as an agency allocate our resources, or can help us identify, a riverbed is receding, or hey, this part of the forest is now cut down, and this is going to have implications on CO2 levels or oxygen levels, and those are incredibly powerful insights. Well, we've also seen some commercial partners apply artificial intelligence to the geospatial space. And, it's tough for any one person to keep their eye on the whole planet. It's a lot of square footage. But through the use of artificial intelligence, We've seen some partners, notably Planet, which was a company I visited with recently. Really cool use of AI that's able to scan for them and say, hey, this new road wasn't here yesterday, or oh, this part of the forest, there's a new fire here that wasn't here a week ago. You may want to check it out. So it allows organizations, it allows policymakers to target some of their approaches, finite resources to big problems. I'll also say, look, in the public health space or in the health space, I know a lot of folks are thinking about that. We've seen some uses of artificial intelligence that's been used to detect tuberculosis in India, in particular. You can cough into your phone, and the tool is able to say, hey, that cough doesn't sound like a regular cold. You may want to go see your doctor, or oh, you know what, your cough is actually okay. We're also I've seen some really interesting thing with some folks from Philips and the Gates Foundation working on AI-powered ultrasound, and that has huge implications for expecting mothers in rural areas who may not have access to a physician, but say a local healthcare practitioner with the technology on their phone and perhaps a lower cost probe is able to sort of triage a little bit more and say, actually, hey, everything looks great, or hey, maybe you do want to go see a doctor sooner rather than later. And that has huge implications for someone who may live 4 or 5 hours from a hospital or may not have the fare to get there. So it's pretty cool to see these things. It's pretty exciting. Of course, we have to balance the benefit with the risk and understand what this mix looks like for all of us.
Mohamad, let's go right into that. Could you talk a bit about how you frame AI and how you see that balance of it's a tool. It can be used for good, for bad, for impact, for holding back development goals. How do you frame that opportunity and threat in your mind?
Well, do you want to talk specifically about risk or just like
risk? Yeah. How do you think through that balance of for any development challenge? How can AI be applied as a tool, and then what are those potential benefits and risks from that?
Yeah, look, it's interesting, Mike. Like I've been reading a little bit of the press about the Barbenheimer conversations here between Barbie and Oppenheimer. I watched Oppenheimer the other day, and it got me thinking a little bit about the story of nuclear energy and how it came to the world, and there was on one hand, like tremendous promise to keep communities powered and get folks connected to the grid and do it efficiently and do it safely. But you also see in this tool the incredible destruction that it can leave behind its wake. And I think in many ways, a couple of years ago, we saw it during the pandemic, what technology was used for. We saw basic technology that, I shouldn't say basic, but now it seems a little more basic, right? Like we saw how social media was used for disinformation, but we also saw that sometimes a lack of that meant some folks couldn't get access to information. We also saw during the pandemic that young people without that basic access to an internet connection were turning in their homework from a McDonald's parking lot. And I'm not talking about overseas, I'm talking about here in the United States. We saw how that opened up a lot of inequality and basically a lot of lagging in learning outcomes for students, and particularly that impacts students, from different social strata and different communities more than others. I think with artificial intelligence, like any technology is going to evolve very quickly, and probably faster than the policy will. What I center, and I have to say I'm really proud of my team for really grounding us in this, is thinking about our values around them. And that is a safe, open, secure, and inclusive digital ecosystem. And I think that sort of transcends any one particular tool. I think it was specific to artificial intelligence, a huge economic opportunity ahead, but also great risk, not just from disinformation, things like deep fakes that we're seeing, the velocity and the volume of mis and disinformation that really can have impact on communities, and not just sort of in the democracy space, in the health space, and a number of different areas. But I also think about, these are very powerful tools, and what happens to the folks who don't have access to them? What does that do to them in the job market, in the labor market? What does that do to their well-being? Those are really important questions for folks to think about. So we really are trying to balance that risk and reward. The final thing that I'll say is we've been talking a lot about generative AI, and generative AI in many ways it is certainly based on large language models. Well, I would also prompt the question, USAID primarily works in the global south. And what does it look like when folks in the global south are left out of those large language models? Their stories, their narratives, their images are used in ways that are not consistent with how they see the world. So I think these are some larger ethical questions. We're in an age now where I think we're more conscious of diversity, equity, and inclusion, access, all these things. And I think there's an opportunity for, as we think about the development of powerful AI tools, it's not just about diverse communities at the table, but truly having tools that work for people around the world. It does require them to have a voice in the development and the construction of these tools. So I'll pause there. I think we can go on for a while. But,
no, that's great,
Mohammed. To hear what Alexis has to say too.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Alexis, do you want to share some thoughts? And last time we had you on was right after ChatGPT's big splash. But what we talked about on that show was that wasn't an overnight thing. That was just the first time I think a lot of people in the general public got that wow experience of this is actually something quite powerful. Could you share a little bit about what you've seen in terms of the evolution of AI and other technologies since you were Chief Innovation Officer through today? And then, of course, share any thoughts on Mohammed's comments.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me okay. Thanks for the patience. Like if this is Mohammed on a bad day, right? How lucky USAID is to have him on mainly good days. I think, to echo a few of the things that he covered, AI is all around us, right? So I think the most important thing is for us to think that AI is an all of a sudden thing, right? Whether it's how we get our weather, whether it's avoiding the amount of spam we could be getting, whether it is quite frankly, being able to push off adversarial cyber or other types of attacks, right? So, AI is really very woven into our fabric in many ways and will only continue to be more. I think, what I really loved about what Mohammed was touching on, though, is what does it look like to be intentional, right? And how we use these tools. One of the things that we've tended to see is that, especially with generative AI tools or other things, you'll often have people talk about it like, the AI is doing this, right? Or the AI is trying to take my job. And I think it's really important that we not absolve ourselves. Like AI is a tool that does what we tell it to do with the information we tell it to do it, which means that, we as practitioners, as users, have an entire, kind of opportunity to shape this technology to be useful, right? Or to avoid, a lot of the harms that, that Mohammed reached out. And so I think there's really interesting questions, to his point, from a larger, donor or philanthropic lens, like how might, we actually lean in to make sure it's getting trained, right? I know there are different companies right now who are working on actually preservation of language by doubling down and making sure that those languages and things like that are part of AI, spectrum. So I think what I love about where we're at is enough kind of consciousness that we've got to be really intentional, but also some practicalities of how we might do that, right? How we might meet the moment. For me, I think what's really interesting, just as a person and as a leader, is that really technology is nothing until it's wielded by people, right? And so I really ask myself, well, what is the relationship with this technology? How does it impact who I am or what I do? And one of the reflections that I really had based on some research that I had been doing is, I'm sure many tuning in right now, you probably feel a bit more overwhelmed than ever. You feel probably a bit more like you're not enough hours in the day. You're feeling that, what does it look like to get leadership right, with all of that? And part of the reason I call that out is because we're navigating a different rate of change than we were just a few years ago. And that is, partially because of things that COVID drove, partially because of these technologies, but, the 24-hour news cycle, you can put lots of reasons onto why this is happening. But the impact on us means that, we are now, in essence, being asked on average to make 5 times more decisions in the same period of time that we did just a few years ago. Add to that the fact that 90% or so of the world's data coming online in the last 3 years, what it looks like for Mohammed and I, right, to make good, responsible decisions as public leaders and public servants means I might be thinking, and I might really be needing to access 100,000 times, 1,000,000 times more information, right? To Mohammed's example on planet in particular, the amount of climate or geo or satellite data that we have now to be able to influence decisions or options that we have to respond is fundamentally different than it was. So I say that because I think it's a really natural time that when we're facing lots of changes, when we're facing having to navigate a lot of information, what becomes finite is actually our attention. And so this question about how do technologies or tools allow us to take in more, right? To curate more, to make better decisions. And I really look at, for myself, leveraging AI to say, how do I direct it in the ways that I'm comfortable with to be my super processor, right? And allow me to take in more information. And what that really means is I'm confronting, and I'm sure Mohamed and others are, what is the unique relationship with knowledge that these technologies are now allowing us to have? And how am I intentional about how to leverage that, that knowledge? So I think for many people have a question of how do I get started? What do I do? For me, I was actually being convinced, ironically, by USAID's team about the importance of AI. So I didn't start in that place. I saw the practical implications, and that's what's led me to where I am. But part of it was really exercising curiosity, right? And kind of a certain amount of humility, and just starting to play or interact or use tools so that I could be aware of how they were relevant to me. And I'll give you an interesting experiment that I've been running lately on people and how they interact with AI, and I'll end there. What is really interesting to me right now is the idea of querying, right? So if for those who've gone to BARD or ChatGPT or any of these LLM tools, what's so interesting is that the tool serves up what you ask it to, what you design, right? The query or the curiosity, the relationship with knowledge you want to exercise. And what's really interesting is a lot of people worry that is going to take away the value of their expertise, right? Or the value of their experience, or the rich depth that they have about a topic, and kind of bring mediocrity. And actually, I found something very different in my research. I found that, an opportunity in essence to kind of say, okay, I think of it like having 10,000 interns, right? That kind of get me started, but I still have to exercise my expertise and my experience, but particularly in querying. And I encourage folks to do this out there. When you go in and you ask a question, you're going to ask it differently than the person next to you, right? Than the teammate across from you, because you have a different set of experiences to draw on. And one of the interesting behaviors that I saw in the experiment last week was I had about 10 people, 12 people in a group, and I gave them an assignment, right? I said, okay, go to chat, gave them 10 minutes and said, go to ChatGPT and write a policy paper on why we should add or remove a plastic bag tax, right, in a local area. And what was really interesting was the behaviors. About 3 people went in and queried, and they used the exact language that I had, right? The exact same thing, put it in the system, and then got the answer. And then that took about a minute. And then they spent the other 9 minutes sitting there. Another 3 people, went in, and their query, they actually customized, right? They used their experience. Some of them asked for more facts or citing. Some of them asked for a more kind of convincing or compelling argument, right? Everyone put their flavor, and they got, a fundamentally better product out of it, as you can imagine. But even they stopped after the first question, right? The third group, in essence, made their own unique query based on their experience, but then they spent the other 9 minutes refining it, right? Exercising more curiosity, making it better. Now add facts. Now give me the citings. Now, give me examples or things like that. And you can imagine at the end of that product, they were using the exact same tool, right? But the outcome was fundamentally different by the behavior, value, and way they chose to exercise their relationship with that knowledge and to command that knowledge. So that's a very long-winded way, but example of saying, that the tool is not upon us. It is we upon the tool. And the question is whether it's a simple thing like translation or whether it's generative AI. each of us, talking today and listening today, has our relationship with knowledge. And the question is, how are we going to use these tools to, augment those?
And Alexis, one of the many things I appreciate in that is the human role is not a passive one. It's not, here's the prompt, cool, this is what ChatGPT came up with. I guess that's where we're stopping. But it's like anything else. It's like any other tool. Great, thank you. Mohamad, going back to you, talk about USAID's unique role in supporting. You talked about some of the partnerships you all are working with globally. I mean, the US government supported the development of GPS and the internet. So what do you see in terms of what's USAID's unique role in fostering the ethical development of AI and other tools? And if there's anything you're able to share about what you're working on now, please do.
Yeah, it's a great question, Mike. So I'll just share that when we think about AI, at least within the agency, it's kind of sits into two primary buckets, maybe just kind of generally categorize it. The first is a lot of our operational work, right? So how are you using AI to help with some of your day-to-day tasks, things that can be repetitive, things that can be somewhat automated? And I apologize for my voice, still kind of getting over a little bit of a bug, but excuse me, it's in many ways, those operational things are really interesting because you can, in an environment, in an organization where you've got scarce resources, scarce people, scarce time, and like it literally sometimes feels like the world is on fire and you've just got so much to do. Being able to automate some of these tasks, briefers, letters, things like that, research, you can really allocate people to additional high value tasks. So I think that's exciting, that's interesting, and we'll continue to see how that works out. A lot of it tends to sit in our operational, sort of underneath our chief information officer, excuse me, Jason Gray. He's a great colleague. He has an amazing team, and they're really digging into that. And we're thinking a lot about burden busting applications. Where I tend to sit is more of the programmatic work. I think more of the external facing stuff, and I think a lot of that is really guided by this idea of like, how do we use this very powerful tool responsibly in sometimes environments where there's a lot of vulnerable people, right? Where there may be less resilience to a shock, not necessarily just a climate shock, but just a shock in general. If something happens, like people really can get hurt. So we think a lot about that. We also take an ecosystem approach, right? It's not just about the tool. This is, how does this tool sit in a broader digital ecosystem within our partner countries? And how can we support the responsible use of AI and continue to shape that global agenda? So for us, I'd say a couple of things that we can do. First is like just to continue to strengthen the underlying like policies, systems, and civil society environment that shapes how AI is designed, how it's developed, how it's deployed in partner countries. And this includes, like, as I mentioned earlier, like the quality and representative data sets that are used to build these particular tools. We also think about like access to computing power. In some parts of the world, that computing power, it's just too cost prohibitive and it's expensive. And what is a researcher in Angola going to do if they just aren't able to get access, right? And that has implications for local communities. So we do think about that, and we think about the broader environment. It's less about the individual thing that we've invested in that's really cool and flashy, and we're testing. Yes, that's important, but for us as an agency, we do think about that broader ecosystem and environment. So, we are conversations around like cybersecurity and cybersecurity infrastructure and making sure it's adequate, privacy protections, relevant safeguards for consumers, for individuals, against various policies like that may be harmful to people, right? Like that's real out there. We're also working to help like partner countries think about their workforce that is trained to both address this great challenge and take advantage of it, harness it for their own economic development, for bettering their communities. So we think about that. We also think about it from a risk perspective. How is it going to displace folks in the workforce? And if it does, what else is there to make sure that that is not a catastrophic situation, that folks are still able to get back into the workforce? So we do think about things like that, and we certainly have conversations with our partners, both private sector and other governments around that. More generally, I think we do talk a lot about the inclusion of the global South in the development of these tools. I mean, think about, where are these tools being developed? They're being developed in Northern California, Austin, Texas, maybe in parts of Europe, maybe in the UAE, maybe in China, right? Okay, so what about the rest of the world? How are those folks represented? in the picture. That's a majority of the world's population is in the global south, right? So we continue to advocate for that. From a research perspective, we continue to invest in research around artificial intelligence and its implications, both positive and negative, and everything in the middle. We also think about it as a tool for ourselves to accelerate our own research and discovery as an agency. That's another dimension. And then finally, I would just say, like, we do think a lot about helping folks around the world and building the digital literacy to navigate yet another very powerful tool in this digital ecosystem that we all live in. So I would just say, like, USAID has a lot of different roles. And maybe to summarize, like, yeah, like, we do invest in the really, really cool things that can help a farmer, or can help an expecting mother, or can help, we do those things. But we're also working at more of an ecosystem level to try to make sure that that environment is conducive for other private sector partners to thrive and to, frankly, bring about amazing products that can change people's lives and improve the way we live.
Absolutely. Yeah. Alexis, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to follow that, I think where Mohammed started out with this idea of like, I call it toil, right? So what is it that, we can remove so that people have more time and the purposeful or mission kind of centered work? And there's so much around that. And I know Jason and team are doing incredible work. And that's part of, for me as a CIO, what I look at, and I call it like wormholes. How do I create a wormhole, right? From where we are now versus where we want to be? And how are we conscious about the things that people still want to be doing, right, at the end of that wormhole versus where they are now? I think there's also some really interesting elements for us to think about. Relationship with information at scale and customer intimacy. So, many development organizations now, for example, have call centers, right? And if you think about call center information or feedback, number one, it's a lot. Audio, you're talking about recording, but you're also talking about what a unique experience and opportunity to hear how your customers actually really talk about the thing you're trying to help them with, right? Sometimes I think what can happen to us when we're super passionate about an area or a sector or have been an expert in it for a long time is we take kind of the nomenclature or the wonk or the technical term for granted, right? And really one of the things that's been interesting to me is, like, how do our people, that we're trying to serve actually talk about this issue? And I remember, being with the maternal and some maternal and child health experts. And, there was one woman who just made a great observation. And she's like, I am not a cool 14-year-old living in Nairobi. And, like, I'm sitting here trying to, get her to talk about family planning. Well, that's not the language she uses. That's not the language she's going to relate with. And so being able, where we can, to actually use the power of AI for, to Mohammed's point, both being considerate of privacy, but also, as the tool of scalable intimacy that it is, right? We have to remember that a lot of, especially in something like the subject matter I mentioned, people have different identities. So, for example, as a young woman, I may not be willing to show up in person to your family planning event that you've, created. I may be super interested in the topic, and there may be a way digitally, right, or for me to have another interaction where I do feel safe. And so thinking about, how is it that someone wants to show up? What is the language that they use? And how do we actually use that as a tool of discipline for ourselves to say, maybe we stop using the wonky language. Maybe we go back and call it whatever. In fact, another interesting example is, in some countries, I've seen some groups actually start to take popular media, right, or radio, and actually use generative AI to trace what is the current sentiment, around the population and the subject, but more importantly, how is it being talked about, and how can we actually meet someone, there. Another example that I'll give, which I think is super interesting to, and really a credit to, I think, the experts who were asking themselves these questions. And that is, there was, and I won't call out the sector, but there was a group who, really were willing to kind of turn on the mirror and say, have we been as innovative as we think we've been in this sector, or as we kind of claim to? And what they did was a very simple exercise. They took the last kind of 15 years of their RFPs and IDIQs, right? And all of the ways that they had asked for and had programmed. And they took, they asked AI, looking over all of these things, in essence, what percentage of what we have, put through an acquisition process was actually new and novel, right? So taking all of that content and saying like, how much have we moved the needle? And what they found in this particular sector, in this particular focus area, is they had only had 4% change in what they had asked for in 15 years of the discipline. And what I really admired that they observed about that was not necessarily that 4% was wrong or right. But if you think about the amount of time the process takes, to get out there, and if you think about really holding ourselves accountable, what they realize is, or they're commenting to me, was that they had a very low risk tolerance, right? They tended to go to kind of averaging best practices. And it was it's been a bit of a clarion call for them to say, is 4% the right number? Should we, be expecting a bit more in light of X, Y, or Z? So I think that opportunity isn't always about using AI to do something outward with others or to others. Sometimes it's, what is our own information telling us about us, and being willing and brave enough to say, oh, wow. For example, like our past practice might have been pretty biased, right? It's not necessarily about the AI propagating bias until we actually know that maybe we behaved that way in the past, and how might we change it. So I really think what will be exciting in the next couple of years is, as we see a willingness for many of us as experts and public servants and people who really care, to kind of turn the tool on ourselves, right? And say, how do we level set where we really are? How do we hold ourselves accountable? And how might we behave if we really do want to put, the person we're trying to help in the driver's seat? And I think AI asks a lot of questions and provides a lot of interesting ways to exercise those things.
Yeah, thanks, Alexis. And that's what we're working on with our clients, is trying to create the tools internally so that they can more efficiently do business development, do partnering, do proposal development, and then to free up resources, Mohamad, so that their effort is not focused on tracking RFPs and putting in the proposals, but implementing better. Alexis, I love that you use customers or clients rather than beneficiaries or recipients of the aid, but how can you better engage and serve the clients of the USAID projects? So I guess with that, I want to get into localization too. Mohamad, do you want to share a bit about how you see AI as a tool, or how it may affect localization? Does it make it easier? Does it level the playing field for proposals? Does it exacerbate current inequalities? Because if you don't have the bandwidth to access these technologies, all the established primes are even accelerating further away from local partners. Share your thoughts on localization AI.
All right, lot to share there, but say a couple of things. I can let me just jump right in, and I was gonna go off on a tangent, but I think I can leave a couple of things.
Mohamad, take it wherever you want here. Yeah.
All right. I mean, look, I think there's a huge opportunity here for folks, perhaps in different parts of the world, to harness and really use some of these tools. For instance, to use as a translation tool. Someone who doesn't speak English, you now have access to every foundation in the U.S. to apply. Well, I shouldn't say every, a lot of foundations and grant pots in the U.S. And I do see a world where folks are going to use they're already using artificial intelligence to craft proposals. And look, that's great from an access perspective. That's great because we are allowing new partners, new people to step up, new solvers to say, you know what, with a little bit of money, I can solve this problem in my community. Amazing. Okay, great. Now, for folks in a grant making organization, what we have to think about then is, okay, that's great for access, but what about the back end? Like, is this organization actually a thing? What does that look, right? What does that part of the equation look like? So those are things I think just part of this natural evolution, and certainly has an impact for localization. I'd say a couple other thoughts. Like Silicon Valley's got they tend to run a lot of these business models that really their incentive is about rapid scaling, build, deploy, just get the product out. And fine, it is what it is. They a lot of these actors are bringing really very powerful tools to the marketplace. But again, I think about how are they factoring in local voices? Some of these companies have regional offices. I would just sort of say, like, how are you utilizing to bring in that local perspective, that local knowledge, that local expertise? How are you building it into your LLMs? How are you building it into your data set? So I would say that's one piece that just is a little bit of a question mark for me. And I hope that folks have learned over the last few years by watching some of frankly, the world around us, whether it was 9/11 and realizing that our world doesn't have borders and we're all interconnected, or George Floyd's killing and recognizing, hey, we've got to do a better job of addressing inequality. All these things are interconnected. And I think as technology companies continue to push out their products, let's have that same sensitivity to say, oh, we are all interconnected into the way we build AI tools. I don't think that's any different. And that has, I think, a big impact on localization. There's a pretty separately, I would also say there's like a pretty robust open source community that works on AI, that's building tools that can also empower local AI developers around the world. I think that's really powerful. That's exciting to see. I think a lot of those innovators in the global South, they do certainly face a lot of challenges, but I chatting with my teammate Chris Burns, who serves as our Chief Digital Development Officer, and we were talking a little bit about this localization piece, and Chris was saying, look, for a lot of countries, they're going all in on it because they see that this is how we can leapfrog in a place where cumulative advantage is such a big barrier, and they don't have that cumulative advantage that say European countries might have, or more well-resourced countries might have. So you've got countries, some folks are going, we're going all in on AI. This is our opportunity to leapfrog. So that's also kind of exciting and interesting to see how that shifts, the center of gravity when we talk about artificial intelligence and the development of these tools. Who's doing it? How are they doing it? How rapidly are they doing it? How are they addressing local challenges? It's interesting to watch, and I can't say that I necessarily have all the answers around that. I say, look, big picture for us at USAID is that our priority is to make sure that citizens in the global South are able to navigate this opportunity and this risk, right? That those tools are out there, and we are doing what we can to help safeguard, but also making sure that innovation thrives. We're investing a lot in that digital literacy that's tailored to these emerging technologies and how it's being deployed and developed. And I'd say, my heart is the heart of an educator. I firmly believe that is what is hopefully going to maintain, I won't say outlast, but technology has just developed so quickly, and it's going to continue to evolve very quickly. And we want to make sure that our young people, and frankly all people, not just young people, have the tools and the mindsets to be able to question, to interrogate, to learn and relearn and polish themselves up to get back, to get back into the workforce when necessary, or to be able to identify a piece of news or a piece of media and say, that actually doesn't look legit, or to question sources. Like, all of that comes back to that literacy. Some of it is what we call global competence. Some of it is digital literacy. And these days, I really feel like it's very much intertwined. And that has an implication on local communities around the world.
Yeah, and I think that point of literacy as well has an implication on us, right? I think that there are many people who, and I think there's even a question, worried about, like, am I going to lose my job? What does that mean? And what I would say is, what's really interesting about my observations of AI is, first and foremost, it does benefit the novice, right? In essence, it helps shrink the time, from not knowing much to being able to know more much more quickly, right? And we used to have to earn that through many years and many trips and many interactions. I think another thing that we're going to have to be really honest with ourselves about, to Mohamed's point, which I just think is brilliant, is that our customers, and when I say that, national governments or health ministers or any of those, folks overseas, they are becoming far more sophisticated, far more quickly, in the sense of their expectations and how they expect technology to be intertwined. And so when we look at what, types of interventions or solutions or programs, if we show up, right, and we have programs and they're being offered things, that in essence, Mohamed's point, leapfrog the whole need, for those, then we're going to, there's going to be a question of relevance. And so I think we have to be willing to shift our mindset and to have more appreciation and show kind of more, more curiosity and more honor about the fact that our customers are, in some cases getting much more smart, much more risk tolerant and things like that than we are. And I think being able to kind of say, okay, how does that actually change the landscape of the value proposition we bring and the forms that we bring it? And I think that's, really, really, critical point. I think also to Mohamed's point, like from an open source standpoint, there is so much code, so many models, so many parsers out there that have already been created, and especially sometimes by, big tech, and they'll do it because it's a nice thing to do once, and then they just leave it there. Like there's a gold mine in open source for all of the entities right now where you could take that, right, and bring USAID a unique application, right, or offer to scale it. You don't always have to have, it doesn't always have to be homegrown. It doesn't always have to be your data scientist or what have you. I think this idea of, kind of recycle, reuse, remaster is going to be a really interesting territory for what I would call kind of global public goods, right? So seeing how we can have collective, data sources, how we can have collective model libraries, how we can encourage, from acquisition lenses, the reuse of, of particular tools and technologies. I think also recognizing that how we can have oftentimes when we think about partnership, right, classically from a development standpoint, we might think about, we'll do a water program with Coca-Cola because Coke cares about water and we care about water. Like we may want to think about the fact that Coke may have a lot of local customer data around preferences or information or distribution that is way more valuable to us, quite frankly, than a water project. And so that in some ways, I tell people, be knowledge greedy, right? Like look at a partnership and don't just look at the normal boundaries. Look at what that additional knowledge or the ability to bring that in and to layer it, can do to fundamentally change, how we think about these things differently. And so, I think there's good things happening there. I think that, in the point of being someone who can thrive in a changing environment. Personally, I always look at chaos as opportunity, right? And this is one of those times where, this is new enough where if you lean in, if you start to play, if you become familiar with, some of the tools, ChatGPT, Bard, but Teachable Machine is a great free tool out there that works on audio, video. You can play around. You don't have to know how to code a single thing. I do not code. I'm a CIO. I do not code. I'm not an engineer. Like you could still be really valid, right? With, with the background and with the human knowledge and experience that you bring. But I think particularly the reality is that you will be expected to command a larger suite of information and to be more proficient. So I would say go and practice querying, right? Go and run little experiments, like I do. And I'll give a final example, from a manager lens. One of the things that was so interesting for me as I was doing learning my own things about, my knowledge base and querying is that I started to realize how thoughtful and how careful I was when I used a generative AI tool to be very specific and very rich and very full about what I told it to do, right? I would say, write a memo that is compelling and it's inspiring for this audience, right? That achieves these things, that highlights these points, and it would give me a beautiful product. And you know what I realized, Mike and Mohamed? I realized, gosh, I'm a better supervisor to ChatGPT than my own people, right? Because I didn't take the same period of time or thoughtfulness, right, to assign something to someone in my team. And so now I literally joke that I have like a what would I do in ChatGPT bracelet where, when I'm sitting down and, I want to tackle something or have one of my team members do something, I really think, what's the richness and intent, that I can really provide this person as a member of my team or my staff that is the same amount of clarity, right? The same amount of information, the same amount of richness of direction that I would give, to ChatGPT. And to close it, I had an ironic kind of piece of feedback from one of my staff members lately, who, as I put this in practice, said, like, you really listen more. You take you're taking like more time. I feel like I understand what you need better, right? And how interesting that my own desire, right, to be relevant, to learn how to query and things like that, also kind of gave me a lesson in leadership, right, and how I communicate with others. And so I think the more we can be, AI is a learning tool. The more you can be cognizant of learning along with the tool or of the tools, really, I think the better chance we have in these technologies being used the right way and to power, the type of human impact that we all believe they could have.
Hey, Mike, can I riff on something real quick that Alexis said that really kind of sparked some thinking
Take
on
it
this
away,
localization
Mohamad.
topic? Alexis, I loved what you said about, I think you said like scalable personalization or something like that. Was that right?
Scalable intimacy. Yeah.
Scalable intimacy. And we all go on our, you go on your Amazon app or you go on to Spotify, Apple Music, and you see these suggestions. I mean, your previous question was about localization. And again, I think about this world where sometimes we assume that everybody in the world speaks English, but like my, previous life did some work in world languages. And look, 25% of the world speaks English. And of that 25%, much of it is still very limited English. So much of the world, probably 3/4 of the world doesn't speak English. So when I think about that scalable intimacy and I think about that personalization, I really do think about the immense opportunity to connect with like indigenous communities who are not going to speak English, people who speak Amharic and Dari and Wolof and Hausa and Arabic and all these like less commonly taught languages, less commonly spoken languages, and the opportunity to really drive access to the rest of the world and for exchanges and for learning opportunities in two-way, not just not just from the global north, but there's a lot we can learn from others around the world. I think there's a tremendous opportunity there. And that sort of that comment, Alexis, about scalable intimacy and scalable personalization. Like, again, I really think about, some of the tools that we've supported and developed for an expectant mother in, rural, take your pick country, super powerful, but that's not being done in English. And we've got to be aware of how folks, sort of cultural nuances. So to your point, perhaps I want to underscore that of like technical expertise is important. I saw one of the questions from an audience member in the chat box of like, how can I prep? Sure, there's the technical piece. Do that, stay up to date. But don't forget about the human element. Don't forget about culture. Don't forget about language. Don't forget about that, right? I think I'll throw one last nugget in. I saw a study a couple of years back that's, there's all this talk of like, engineers are making so much more money coming out of undergrad. And sure, that's probably true for your first few jobs. But I also saw a different study that was saying majority of CEOs didn't have technical backgrounds. They actually had humanities backgrounds. And I think as we're in this new world of technology just touching every aspect of our lives, for those thinking about career development, for those thinking about what the future holds, try to find that mix. Don't forget about the human element. In some ways, that's what made Steve Jobs so special, is he brought, this very human element into a device that, is glass and silicon chips, right? But that human element, that human interface was really important. So again, I've been thinking a lot about that in terms of our programming and our work and skill development and things like that. But just appreciated that thought, Alexis.
Well, and if I can riff on that, it hits really close to home, right? I started as an advertising and PR major. I'm now the chief information officer of one of the top research labs in the country. And I think, to double stamp your message, technology only matters. It's crap unless we're using it as people. And so I really encourage you, for those who are listening, and I think Mohamad's very similar, right? In innovation, but comes from a very wide background. Don't be afraid. Like, you are relevant. Your experience is relevant. Your soft skills have more to do with great technology and great interventions and the leadership that's required there than any kind of, qualification or certification or things like that you can have. Like, there is space for all of us, in the technological frontier. And my biggest, piece of advice, to Mohammed's point, is don't be afraid. You are 100% relevant, and you are 100%, have a potential to be a game-changing technologist, even if you don't know how to write a single, piece of code, because technology is about people ultimately. So I hope, if anything else, go away from this conversation and just don't be afraid. Everything is figure outable.
And Alexis, you mentioned space. I think there's a requirement, a need for everyone to participate. Mohammed, to your point, I'm the founder of Aid Connect Data Software. I was a creative writing major in undergrad. So absolutely. We're wrapping up here. What we'd like to do is wrap up with a so what question. So for aid partners around the world, from this conversation, great. So what? They're going to finish listening to this episode. They go back to implementing programs, winning proposals. They don't have time to, spend weeks marinating on this. What's some tactical suggestion or just a thought that you want to leave the international aid and development partners globally with from this conversation? Alexis, do you want to go first?
Sure. So number one, don't be afraid. Play. This is all about knowledge and people. And quite frankly, the advantage that as an organization or as someone, who is looking for work and for purpose, like, you have to be curious about how to command knowledge in a digital age. And I think, the last thing is that, there's some elements of this that are inevitable. But how you decide to respond, to the opportunity and to be one of those great leaders who helps us be thoughtful, et cetera, that's within your power. It's not being done to you, right? It is either being done with you or without you. And so my hope is that it can be done with you.
Thank you, Mohammed.
Yeah, I jump in. Look, I love what Alexis said about keeping it human-centered. I think that's a big part of this. And what we should all take away from that is, like, what are our values here? The tools that we're developing, we're in an age where these tools have a lot of power and can impact communities in ways that we sometimes don't think about. So be reflective, be intentional, but center your values. Make sure what you're doing is ultimately rights respecting, because whether something is developed in a government research lab or in a commercial R&D lab for a company, or in a hallway in Silicon Valley, like, it's going to impact people's lives. So be mindful, be thoughtful, think about unintended consequences, and kind of center those values of respecting and keeping people safe.
If I can add one other thing, because it happened to me last week and it is game changing. So when we think about AI, and to Mohammed's point on compute, I went in ChatGPT 4 Plus, which is in essence a premium subscription, so it's $20 a month. So I realize not everyone can get that, but there is now image generation embedded in that. And I will tell you, I will predict right now that the images that we start to see that take over PowerPoint, that take over, submissions, et cetera, you are going to start to see some of the most incredible images that are curated and created from those of you who are on the call right now, from your minds, from your lips, from your words. And it's fundamentally, like, game changing. So if you're going to play, the final thing I would also say is that the compute alone, it's like, this is actually a very inexpensive time, to be able to use these tools. They will probably not stay inexpensive forever. So my hope would be, do lean in, do try them, but really get robust, because from an image generation alone, it's completely changed the way I tell stories. I literally do comic book presentations now instead of PowerPoints, and people love them. They're so much more fun. They're so much more rich. So I guess long story short is have fun with it.
Wonderful. We'll wrap it up with that. Alexis, Mohammed, thank you so much for taking some time to share your expertise with our audience. I know they're always very interested to hear about what you're doing, Mohammed. All the best to you and your team with the important work you're doing at USAID. And Alexis, thank you as always for sharing your AI and tech expertise with us. With that, we'll wrap it up. Feel free to message me, Mike Shanley, on LinkedIn with any follow-up questions. And thank you all very much. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you for tuning in to the Aid Market Podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and connect with Mike Shanley on LinkedIn to stay updated on the latest USAID funding trends.